Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's discuss the best diet for leaky gut. And as you're probably accustomed to hearing, gut health is crucial because of nutrient absorption. That's pretty obvious. But the other that's a little bit more pernicious is the fact that when your gut is unhealthy, this can increase inflammation throughout the body. Well, why is that? Because the largest density of immune cells in your entire body is actually in the lining of your small intestine. And if too much leaks through, if leaky gut or hyperpermeability is present, then the immune system vis-a-vis inflammation is called in to clean up the mess. And that inflammation can go systemic. And this is why we see correlations between leaky gut and obvious symptoms like gas, bloating, abdominal pain, diarrhea, or constipation, but also things that may not be quite as obvious and are distal to the gut. Neurological involvement like depression, insomnia, anxiety, joint pain, environmental reactivity, just to name a few. So the importance of your gut is really the centerpiece of your health. And this is why how to eat for a healthy gut is so important. And the one thing I want to lead with is that there is not one diet that is best for leaky gut. Sure, there are some foods that aren't going to help anyone. This would be ultra-processed foods and alcohol. And there are other foods that will probably be helpful for most everyone. Polyphenol-rich foods, glutamine-rich foods, and we'll detail all this in a moment. But the one thing above all else I'm hoping to contribute with this conversation is that there are a number of foods that for some people can be helpful, but for other people can be triggering. And this is why, for those of you listening or watching this, you may have had the experience of, I feel like I'm doing everything for my gut. I'm doing all the healthy food stuff, yet I'm still having symptoms. And this might be because you haven't quite yet put your finger on some of these foods that, again, for some people are helpful and for other people can be triggering. And I'll lead with this one analogy. I don't think anyone would argue that going for a jog is unhealthy. But if you had an active injury, let's say you had a low back injury, then an otherwise healthy activity, running, might flare you. And if you didn't realize you had said back injury, you'd be running and saying, I'm going for a run. I'm not even pushing myself too hard. I'm wearing the right shoes. I warmed up, all the things. Yet I'm still noticing that otherwise healthy activity, running, is flaring my back pain. The same thing can happen with your gut. And so let's walk through the foods to eat, the foods to avoid, and then some of those middle ground foods that, if you get these right, can really lead to a lot of healing and repair in the gut. So let's start with an obvious avoid, or at least reduce, which would be alcohol. There was one study that I think was really misquoted. It was a 2014 trial in which they injected directly into the small intestine alcohol. They did find increased leaky gut via a few different measures: lactose mannitol ratio, or lactulose mannitol ratio, tight junction protein upregulation. And to quote this paper, this study demonstrates that administration of a single moderate ethanol dose increased both small and large intestinal permeability in healthy volunteers. Now, the challenge here, hopefully fairly apparent, is that this was injecting alcohol directly into the small intestine. This is not a normal route of administration, or at least I hope it's not. What other data do we have regarding alcohol? Yes, you could argue wine has rich polyphenols and those antioxidants are health promoting. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, unless we're really going to be moderate with our consumption. And so this then begs the question, well, how much alcohol is acceptable? Again, I don't think anyone would argue alcohol is overtly health promoting, but if you're like many people, you may want to be able to go to a dinner and have a glass of wine or have a drink here or there. And if you're trying to optimize your health, having guidelines for how much alcohol might be reasonable is helpful. So a 2018 observational trial, fairly large, 600,000 individuals, wanted to answer this question. They also did something very important in that they adjusted for confounding variables. How old are you? What is your sex? Are you a smoker? Do you have diabetes? So after controlling for all those, What they found was that risk of mortality or death increased at 7 drinks per week. This tells us about risk of mortality, risk of death. It doesn't tell us necessarily about the risk of morbidity, symptoms, but I think we can assume it's clearly going to be somewhere less than 7 and probably more than 1. So what I would submit to you as sort of a practical interpretation of this is the better you're feeling, the healthier you are, the less symptoms, especially digestive symptoms that you have, the more alcohol you can get away with. And I think 2 to 3 drinks per week is probably reasonable. The more you're currently in the throes of not feeling well, that's where I'd be more judicious with alcohol. I never want to paint any of these things as extreme because this can foster undue stress. So if you do find yourself out and you are having a glass of wine and a healthcare educator has been very overzealous about the messaging, don't ever have any alcohol. What that could do is start this cascade of worry and fear, which in and of itself is detrimental to health and healing. So I don't think we have a very clear answer on alcohol. Again, the worse you're feeling, the more I would abstain. And I would never, or I'd really try to avoid routinely going above 7 drinks per week, and perhaps 2 to 3 drinks per week is reasonable. The other food that's a fairly obvious don't consume, or at least generally avoid, would be UPFs, or ultra processed food. And these are foods that have been highly modified so as to increase the shelf life and the palatability. And I thought Kevin Whelan at King's College said it well, quoting, "Food additives are added to many UPFs, ultra-processed foods, and have themselves been shown to affect gut health. Evidence shows that some emulsifiers, sweeteners, colors, microparticles, and nanoparticles have effects on the gut microbiome, intestinal permeability, and intestinal inflammation." So because of this, we want to avoid ultra-processed or processed, moderate to highly processed meats and carbohydrates. So for meats, this would be anything salted, smoked, cured, dried, or canned. And in part, this is due to the nitrates, and the nitrosamines those lead to, which also occur in vegetables, by the way. Hot dogs, bacon, sausage, deli meats, these are things that I wouldn't make dietary staples. I wouldn't advise to have bacon or sausage every day. Could you? Yes. I think it would be better to make that more of a once in a while sort of thing. Maybe bacon once per week, maybe twice, maybe some sort of sausage once or twice per week. But these things can add up pretty quickly. If you're having a processed breakfast sausage every morning, and then at lunch you're having, let's say, deli turkey, this is just accruing more and more processed foods in your diet. And with the carbohydrates, they are fairly laden with emulsifiers, colors, and sweeteners. So think sweets, sugary drinks, sodas, fast foods, potato chips. Now, whole potatoes would be different than potato chips. So again, it's not to say you can never have any of these, but these are things that you want to be judicious with. And you can certainly have, let's say, pork, but consider pork loin that you cook at home, or a pork chop, things that haven't been processed so as to increase their shelf life. Another food to put on your radar would be non-organic foods. Let me lead by saying, I don't think everyone needs to be eating all organic all the time. I think that's too high of a bar for many people. There are no human studies directly assessing leaky gut and the impact of non-organic foods on leaky gut. However, there is a 2014 meta-analysis that did find that organic foods contain more polyphenols, which are antioxidants, that have been shown to reduce leaky gut. So think about it this way. We should favor conventional whole foods over organic processed foods, meaning conventionally raised chicken breast over organic chicken nuggets. And that's a simple framework I would apply, and do the best that you can. I wouldn't say this is a make or break, but this is one thing that if you can do this as you're able, will at least give you a little bump if for no other reason than the richer polyphenol content. And that brings us to polyphenols more squarely. Again, these are antioxidants in plant foods that give them color, but they also protect the plant. And this is part of the reason why you may have heard the axiom of eating the rainbow. Various colors will have, of plants that is, will have different polyphenol content. So this is why not just having greens, but having reds and oranges and purples in your diet is a good strategy. And coming back to some of the research here, a 2021 randomized control trial gave 50 subjects 3 servings per day of polyphenol-rich foods for 2 months. And to quote the authors of the paper, these data show for the first time that a polyphenol-rich diet can reduce serum zonulin levels, serum zonulin being a blood test for leaky gut. And by the way, if this has been helpful, please subscribe, comment, and if there's one person you think this might help, please share it. Okay, moving on to one of the foods that can go either way for people, and this is fermented foods. Fermented foods, as you may know, are rich in probiotics due to the live cultures they contain. One case in point, 2020 clinical trial using kefir, fermented dairy, 1 cup per day for 3 weeks. Quoting the findings, our study is the first showing that kefir supplementation causes an improvement in serum zonulin levels. 2 other randomized control trials examined kimchi or sauerkraut and found that 1 to 2 cups of these per day for 2 to 3 months improved the symptoms of IBS, constipation, diarrhea, distension, abdominal pain. So there's certainly a case to be made, and I've said before, that including fermented foods in your diet to obtain probiotics is a great and evidence-based health practice. However, there does seem to be an upper limit with these foods for some people. If you're someone who's noticed you are environmentally sensitive, maybe you have allergies of some sort, maybe sometimes when you eat, you notice you have a runny nose, or you have fatigue, brain fog, and insomnia that you're not sure what's driving it, it is possible that you could be over-consuming histamine. And histamine is a byproduct of that fermentation that the bacteria do. And for some people, they have a already high level of endogenous or internally produced histamine. Now, case in point for this is one, albeit older, randomized control trial that fed people a higher histamine diet. And they found heart palpitations, low blood pressure, loose bowels, allergy symptoms, headache, flushing, fatigue, runny nose, environmental reactivity, and insomnia, all either started or could be spurred by a high histamine intake. So this is just one of those foods, and this is something I actually experienced personally, where there was a point where I was eating what I call the lazy man's paleo diet. I would wake up, have a kombucha, a pack of beef jerky, some spinach, and some avocado. Every one of those foods is healthy and convenient, but is also high histamine. And that resolved, and when I stopped doing that, why I was noticing for no reason I was irritable, fatigued, and foggy. So this is something to bear in mind. And this is one of the culprits for some people who say, the better I eat, the worse I feel. Not going to be everyone, but it's just something to have your feelers out for. And I wanted to share with you a breakdown of the histamine content of different foods. So what you're seeing here is the amount of histamine that was produced by using a supplemental probiotic, and it was negligible. Now we can compare that to the amount of histamine contained in some common fermented foods. You'll see that kefir is actually the lowest in histamine. So if you're someone who is suspecting that you might be histamine sensitive, kefir is probably going to be the best fermented food. And bear in mind, it's also, most kefirs are also lactose free. And then you start seeing progressively more histamine in yogurt and sauerkraut, and then much more in kimchi. Conversely, remember that we've discussed that kimchi is actually probably the richest source of probiotics, but that may come with some strings attached, which is a higher level of histamine in that food. Again, just remembering that you want to be careful not to overdo it with histamine intake. So if you're someone who feels like you're doing a lot of things right dietarily, but still struggling with symptoms, this might be the culprit. Take stock of your diet. And if you're seeing at nearly every meal, you're consuming one or a couple high histamine foods, try focusing on the low histamine foods for about a week. And usually it takes only a week, maybe a touch longer, but usually the response here is pretty quick to see these symptoms improve when reducing the load of histamine in your diet. And I just wanted to juxtapose the probiotic content here. You'll see that there's a pretty similar amount of probiotic in a supplemental probiotic as compared to sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, and kimchi. Kimchi gets you a higher dose of probiotics, like I said earlier, but all of these are suitable approaches to obtain probiotics. If, again, you do suspect you're histamine sensitive, I would opt for either a probiotic or the kefir. And if you don't suspect that you are, then there's nothing here to worry about. The next food or type of food to consider would be foods that are glutamine and collagen rich. And this is because glutamine is a very crucial amino acid and very abundant amino acid in the lining of the gut. And the best evidence point for this was Kiki Zhao, who's over at Tulane University, and we're hoping to have a conversation with her on the podcast in the near future. 2019 clinical trial. She administered, admittedly, a high dose of glutamine, 15 grams per day, which you won't be able to get from food. You will need to supplement in order to hit that. But she demonstrated a normalization of a different test for leaky gut, the lactulose mannitol ratio test, and an 80% improvement in IBS symptoms. So beef, chicken, lean meats, eggs, and bone broth are just some glutamine-rich sources to consider including in your diet. And again, this is because that amino acid will help with repair of the lining of the gut. Similar but different, omega-3s, you've likely heard of fish oil because it's anti-inflammatory. A 2016 observational study did find that increased omega-3 fatty acid intake correlated with lower levels of zonulin in women. So opting for fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, tuna, sardines, or nuts and seeds, flax, chia, and walnuts, and targeting to eat 2 servings of fatty fish per week or 1 serving per day of nuts and seeds. And this dovetails nicely in the theme of anti-inflammatory to certain herbs and spices. Turmeric or curcumin is a Indian spice. There's one pretty interesting randomized control trial from 2021. They administered 500 milligrams per day of curcumin as a supplement. After 2 months, they documented a 28% reduction in gastrointestinal symptoms, so pain, diarrhea, constipation, and indigestion. And get this, a 52% reduction in anxiety. And this is likely due to the gut-brain connection, partially mediated via inflammation. So the objective here would be 1 to 2 tablespoons per day of turmeric or 500 milligrams per day of curcumin. A few others to consider would be peppermint and clove. Part of the reason for these is these are 2 of the richest spices regarding polyphenol content. And additionally, ginger, cinnamon, rosemary, and thyme. And these are things that you may just want to season your food with or do something like a ginger tea. Now we get into more controversial territory, whole grains. These break down, in my view, to gluten-containing and gluten-free. And I think it's important to not just throw all of the grain baby out with the bathwater because some people are gluten sensitive. Remember that brown rice, oats, and quinoa are gluten-free. And then you have whole wheat, barley, and rye. Now, there's no studies, to my knowledge, that directly assess whole grain consumption being increased and decreasing leaky gut. But there is a 2020 systematic review that found, and I'll quote here, intake of whole grains increased bifidobacteria and lactobacillus levels and reduced pathogenic bacteria. So I think it's a mistake to say no one can ever have whole grains, especially because there are some people that don't do well on lots of fermented foods and lots of vegetables and do better on a moderate to higher protein and starch type of diet. And we just want to honor the different people and put people and their improvements first and not necessarily a dietary philosophy. To acknowledge gluten and the problematic aspect of gluten in part, is a protein called gliadin. A 2020 clinical trial published in the journal Gut gave patients who suspected they had a problem with gluten a gluten-free diet for 6 months. They documented reductions in serum zonulin, gastrointestinal symptoms, and given this sort of systemic inflammatory connection, improvements in fatigue, anxiety, and joint pain. They also commented that serum zonulin helped to distinguish non-celiac, gluten-sensitive individuals from healthy controls, and that wheat withdrawal was associated with a reduction in zonulin levels. So this is one component. Now, as I've said many a time on the podcast in the past, the prevalence of non-celiac, meaning you're not diagnosable as celiac, gluten sensitivity, but you still notice or suspect you're having a reaction to gluten, is roughly 3, maybe 5% of the population. Some studies show less than that. Some studies show more than that. 3 to 5 is kind of where you average out. So it is something, and it is incorrect for, let's say, your gastroenterologist to say, if you don't have celiac, don't worry about gluten, right? Because this has been documented in fairly rigorous trials. However, I think there's a very crucial component of this that's been left out, and this is wonderfully exemplified by this 2018 randomized control trial. And by the way, there are numerous studies that have found similar to what I'm about to share with you. They took about 60 people who reported they had reactivity to gluten. They were non-celiac gluten sensitive. They were given either a placebo bar or a bar containing gluten or a bar that was gluten-free but was high FODMAP, specifically high in fructans. And what they found is fascinating. The group that was given the gluten had less gastrointestinal symptoms, whereas the group that was given the high FODMAP or the high fructan bar had a clear exacerbation of symptoms. And this enters the other component of gluten-containing foods that's probably more problematic. And this is the FODMAPs. Remember that wheat, rye, and barley, common gluten-containing foods, are also high in FODMAP. So when people go gluten-free, they do two things simultaneously, even if they don't realize it. They go gluten-free, but they also reduce their FODMAP content. And as this study showed, it might actually be the FODMAP that's the trigger and not the gluten, because this study we just covered controlled for and reduced the gluten in one and gave gluten in the other bar, allowing you to see that it seems to be for more people that the FODMAPs are the problem. And here is a list of foods in terms of low FODMAP versus high FODMAP. So grains that are low FODMAP, what we want if you're sensitive: oats, quinoa, brown rice. Conversely, whole wheat bread, barley, and rye are high FODMAP. Then certain vegetables are high FODMAP and maybe triggering. And this is really a very important example for people who feel as though they're eating fairly healthy, but are still struggling with symptoms. It might be your microbiome is imbalanced and you need, at least temporarily, to reduce the FODMAP content. And I'll share the evidence with you here in a moment, but it's pretty replete. And this has been shown to reduce inflammation, reduce leaky gut, reduce symptoms. So other potential triggers would be broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, garlic, onions, avocados, whereas kale, spinach, carrots, cucumbers, green beans, and zucchini could be very tolerated. And this is a key insight because for some people, they can't piece this together. It's not very intuitive in terms of how we determine high FODMAP versus low FODMAP, which is why we're reliant upon food lists like this. And then other fruits that can be triggering that are high FODMAP: apples, grapes, plums, watermelons, and peaches, whereas helpful or lower FODMAP: blueberries, raspberries, cantaloupe, oranges, and strawberries. Now, coming back to the data, a 2021 clinical trial put people on a low FODMAP diet for 3 months, and they found a decrease in multiple measures of leaky gut, LPS, and serum zonulin. Quoting, GI symptoms, psychological state, and QOL, or quality of life, significantly improved in these patients. Simultaneously, an improvement in small intestinal permeability and intestinal mucosa integrity occurred. So zooming out for a moment, you may have heard people say, well, people who go gluten-free see reductions in zonulin, reductions of leaky gut. Well, it might be, as this study is substantiating, the reduction in FODMAP. Why this matters is because FODMAP tolerance is able to be recovered. 50% of the high FODMAP foods that are cut out of the diet can later be reintroduced and tolerance can be recovered, because it could be that the FODMAPs are the problem. And again, we know that a temporary lower FODMAP diet heals leaky gut, reduces inflammation, and also reduces things like dysbiosis and small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and therefore leads to improved tolerance. So if you did want to, let's say, go out and have that glass of wine and also maybe have a slice of pizza or a bowl of pasta or whatever it is, the odds are fairly likely that you will be able to do so. And why I care about this is because I would like for you to have the broadest diet and the most food freedom and not be falsely attributing your improvements on a gluten-free diet to lifelong need to avoid gluten due to the gliadin, but rather it may have been the FODMAPs again, which is recoverable. So hopefully that all makes sense. And moving on to the next food here, dairy, controversial. Lactose malabsorption prevalence in the US is about 42%, and the cow's milk or the casein allergy is anywhere between 1 to 4%. Think about that for a moment. The lactose, the sugar, the carbohydrate, 42% intolerance. In actual protein allergy, 1 to 5%. Now, remember that the other carbohydrates, the FODMAPs, tolerance there is recoverable. Well, same thing here. Meta-analyses have demonstrated that interventions that help heal the gut, namely probiotics, improve lactose tolerance. Now, why is this? Well, when the food reactivity is carbohydrate malabsorption, again, that is recoverable because as the intestinal tract heals, endogenous or your internal production of enzymes also tends to be improved. And that allows absorption and digestion of the carbohydrates that weren't able to be digested prior. Again, why all this matters is if you've had an experience of improvement when cutting out gluten or dairy, it's more likely that it's the carbohydrate malabsorption component that when you reduce those carbohydrates, you saw improvements that led to your improvements. And that is able to be improved. And it's much more rare, although it can happen, but it's more rare that you have a true inflammatory reaction to one of the antigenic proteins in these foods. So zooming way out, the take home here is if you've gone gluten-free or you've gone dairy-free, don't be afraid to reintroduce these foods, because if the issue was carbohydrate malabsorption, that tends to improve over time, and therefore tolerance also tends to improve over time. And if you do perform a reintroduction and you do notice an aversion, then as we always say, listen to your body. But if you haven't run an experiment, it's something to bear in mind. Okay, so then a few foods that are controversial. Artificial sweeteners. If you had asked me on this 5+ years ago, I would have had a more conservative perspective on artificial sweeteners, sort of against them. Looking at this 2023 review paper, I'll quote, although some human trials have observed a dysbiotic effect of artificial sweeteners, many randomized control trials have reported a lack of significant effects on the gut microbiota. Now, the gut microbiota is not leaky gut, but they are interrelated. I'm not convinced in a big credit to Lane Norton, who I think has done some great reporting on artificial sweeteners as it pertains to metabolic health. But I'm not convinced that artificial sweeteners are going to be a problem for everyone. I had cited years ago the San Antonio longitudinal study on aging, and they did find a correlation between higher consumption of artificially sweetened drinks and waist circumference. But evidently, as more research has been done, they're not finding any metabolic ill effects. And we weren't able to find anything convincing showing exacerbations of gastrointestinal symptoms. And so ultimately, I would listen to your body, but I don't think from a data-driven perspective, we can say that artificial sweeteners are going to be a problem for most people and sort of fuel leaky gut. Nightshade vegetables. This is also something where there's not a lot of research, but this is something that I personally have noticed. If I consume too much either tomato or red peppers, I will experience joint pain, as will my mother. So this tends, at least in my observation, to follow family lines. So that's something to think about. If you've done everything else and you're noticing joint pain, take stock of the nightshades that you're consuming and see if you can draw a correlation, which should be repeatable, between consumption of nightshades and joint pain. Usually it starts about 24 hours later. Again, this is not going to be a majority thing, but it's a fine-tuning factor to pay attention to. Seed oils. One study did not find that soybean oil increased lipopolysaccharides. And I think you could make a case that continual heating and reheating of seed oils might pose a problem. But I'm not convinced that seed oils pose a problem for human health. I know this is a loaded topic, and we are reviewing the evidence here, and I plan on releasing a piece that really goes through this in a very thoughtful and evidence-based fashion. And certainly my persuasion is more leaning in the direction away from seed oils because they're not necessarily an ancestral norm, if you will. But when juxtaposing that across randomized control trials that are designed to clarify, is the seed oil the problem, or is it more of a bystander effect or guilt by association? At least thus far, I'm not convinced that seed oils pose a problem. I know that sounds like heresy, but more to follow. And then finally, there's a few plant irritants, oxalates, salicylates, and lectins. And I can't say that, well, firstly, there's not ample research to give us the luxury of having scientific evidence to learn from. So then it's more so anecdote and experience. And I can't say that any of these foods seem to be problematic for most people. Perhaps if someone is consuming a very high amount of oxalates, salicylates, or lectins, reducing that could be helpful. I think what happens more often than not, especially in the case of lectins, people make many changes that improve the quality of their diet, and they think it's because of the lectins, but sort of like the gluten-free example, people go gluten-free, but they actually end up going low FODMAP, and it might be the FODMAP reduction that was actually why they improved. I suspect with lectins, that's what's happening. And at some point, we'll do a full review on lectins also. And then oxalates and salicylates, my perspective here, and I don't think anyone has this fully figured out, but my thinking is that if someone is not consuming a very, very high amount of either one of these, then it's more likely you need to improve the health of their gut by going through all the other steps that we outlined. And the oxalate or salicylate sensitivities are usually secondary to a gut that's not very healthy or sort of running with that back injury. So in close, it's important to experiment with your diet to figure out what is going to be optimal for your individual gut. Everyone should be mindful of alcohol, reduced ultra-processed foods, eat whole, fresh foods, optimize quality like organic when and as you're able, and include certain medicinal or healing foods like polyphenols, glutamine, omega-3s, and anti-inflammatory herbs and spices. Experiment and personalize FODMAPs, gluten, dairy, and high histamine foods. And remember to reintroduce and personalize over time. And this is the key aspect that it's easy to lose sight of, that the foods that you didn't tolerate on day one, you will likely be able to enjoy day 30, 60, 90, 120, what have you. So remember, just like with the rehab plan, coming back to that back injury, you take some time to not stress your body with exercise, do rehab, do foam rolling, laser, whatever it is. And then gradually over time, you're going to resume more activity, more running, maybe even sprinting or squatting or deadlifting. And that's going to be a gradual thing that you do over time as you rebuild and regain resiliency and strength. And the same concept here applies with diet. Well, okay, I hope this helps. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll talk to you next time.